The sun blazed mercilessly over Badwater Crossing, casting sharp shadows across the town square, where a makeshift platform had been erected. Isabeau Moreau stood with her hands bound behind her back, 6 months pregnant and swaying slightly in the oppressive heat. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around her shoulders, and her simple brown dress, stretched tight across her swollen belly, bore the dust and stains of rough handling. The crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with a mixture of righteous anger and bloodthirsty excitement. Voices rose like the howl of desert wind, each one cutting deeper than the last. "The railroad whore," someone spat from the mob. "Cursed woman brings drought and death. Should have driven her out months ago." Isabeau's throat burned with thirst, but she refused to let her knees buckle. Inside her womb, the baby kicked frantically, as if sensing her terror. She pressed her lips together to keep from crying out, not from physical pain, but from the crushing weight of absolute isolation. In this moment, surrounded by hostile faces, she understood what it meant to be truly alone in the world. Her mind drifted to William, to his gentle hands and promises of a future that would never come. He had died believing their love could conquer anything, that their child would be born into a world of hope and possibility. Instead, she faced a lynch mob in a godforsaken desert town, carrying his baby and his secrets, with no one left to stand beside her. Augustus Riddell stepped forward, his black coat immaculate despite the desert heat. At 55, he carried himself with the polished authority of a man who had crushed opposition for decades. His pale gray eyes swept over the crowd with satisfaction. These people belonged to him as surely as the cattle in his corrals. Good people of Badwater Crossing. Riddell's voice carried the practiced cadence of a preacher mixed with the cold calculation of a politician. This woman stands before you as proof of moral decay. She carries the bastard child of unknown parentage, bringing shame and misfortune to our community. He gestured dramatically at Isabeau's pregnant form. "Since her arrival, our wells have run dry, our crops have withered, and discord has spread through our streets like poison. She is a curse upon this land." From the edge of the crowd, Silas Hartwell watched through narrowed eyes, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. At 34, he was lean and weathered, with hands calloused from honest work and storm-gray eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. His ranch lay 3 miles outside town, far enough to avoid most entanglements, close enough to witness injustice when it reared its head. The memory of his sister Sarah flickered through his consciousness like a knife blade. Sarah, 17 and pregnant, driven from their hometown by a similar mob 8 years ago. Sarah, who had died alone in a Denver alley because he had been too young, too scared, too weak to stand up for her. The guilt of that failure had hollowed him out, left him living a half-life on the margins of society. Now, watching another young woman face the same hatred that had killed his sister, Silas felt something crack inside his chest. His hand drifted to the Colt .45 at his hip, then stopped. 1 man against 50 was suicide. But doing nothing, letting this happen again, was a kind of death too. I warn you all. Riddell continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the square. Any who offer aid or comfort to this woman will answer to me personally. I control the water rights, the railroad contracts, the loans that keep your businesses breathing. Cross me, and you'll discover how quickly prosperity turns to ruin. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. Several townspeople shifted uncomfortably, but none stepped forward. Fear was a more powerful master than conscience. Isabeau lifted her chin, her dark eyes blazing with defiance, despite the tears threatening to spill. She would not beg these people for mercy. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. If this was how her story ended, she would face it standing tall. Let this be the last time we see this creature in our town," Riddell announced. "She has until sunset to gather her belongings and leave our territory forever. after that. His smile was colder than winter wind. Well, I trust you good people understand how to protect your community's interests. The crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves. Some looked disappointed that there hadn't been immediate violence. Others seemed relieved. Isabeau remained on the platform untied now, but alone in a way that went deeper than physical isolation. That's when Silas found himself walking forward, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. Every eye in the square turned to watch him approach. He could feel the weight of their stares, the danger of what he was about to do. But Sarah's ghost walked beside him, and for once in his life, he chose courage over caution. "Ma'am," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Silas Hartwell. I've got a ranch outside town. You're welcome to shelter there until you figure out your next move." Isabeau stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign tongue. In her experience, men who approached pregnant women in distress usually had ulterior motives. But there was something different in this stranger's eyes pain that matched her own, and a resolve that seemed carved from bedrock. Why, the word came out barely above a whisper. "Because everyone deserves a chance to live without fear." Behind them, Augustus Riddell watched from his position near the courthouse steps, his pale eyes calculating. He made a mental note to have a very pointed conversation with Mr. Hartwell before the day was through. As Silas helped Isabeau down from the platform, she caught sight of a young woman near the back of the dispersing crowd. Blonde, well-dressed, probably 19 or 20, clearly from one of the town's prosperous families. The girl was staring at Isabeau with an expression that mixed curiosity with something that might have been pity. When their eyes met, the blonde girl looked away quickly, but not before Isabeau glimpsed tears on her cheeks. "Who was that?" Isabeau asked as they walked toward Silas's wagon. "Ellie Palmer, banker's daughter. Don't pay her any mind, she's got her own troubles." But as they drove away from town, Isabeau found herself thinking about those tears. In a sea of hostile faces, one person had shown a flicker of human compassion. It wasn't much, but in her current circumstances, even small kindnesses felt like miracles. The wagon ride to Silas's ranch passed in tense silence, broken only by the creak of wheels and the distant rumble of thunder on the horizon. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, red sandstone cliffs, sparse vegetation, and an endless expanse of sky that made human concerns seem insignificant. But there was beauty in the desolation, a fierce grandeur that spoke to something wild in Isabeau's soul. The Hartwell Ranch occupied a shallow valley between two ridges, the main house built from local timber and stone. It wasn't grand, but it spoke of honest labor and careful maintenance. Corrals held a small herd of horses and cattle dotted the surrounding grassland, though Isabeau noticed the grass looked thin despite the season. Mrs. McKay emerged from the house as they approached a woman of perhaps 55, with steel-gray hair and shrewd brown eyes. She wore a simple calico dress and a no-nonsense expression that didn't quite hide the kindness underneath. "Silas Hartwell," she called out, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "What stray have you brought home this time?" "Christian hospitality, Mrs. McKay. This is Miss Moreau. She'll be staying with us for a spell." Mrs. McKay's gaze swept over Isabeau's condition and disheveled appearance. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I see. Well, come along then, child. You look ready to collapse." The interior of the house was simple, but comfortable, with handcrafted furniture and windows that caught the afternoon light. Mrs. McKay led Isabeau to a small guest room off the main hallway. "There's a wash basin and clean linens," she said briskly. "Supper's at 6. Any foods that don't agree with you in your condition?" The casual kindness in the question nearly undid Isabeau's composure. It had been so long since anyone had treated her like a human being that she'd almost forgotten how to respond. "No, ma'am. I'm grateful for whatever you can spare." "Grateful nothing. You're a guest in this house, not a charity case." Mrs. McKay's voice was gruff, but her eyes were gentle. "Rest now. You've had a hellish day by the look of it." After Mrs. McKay left, Isabeau sank onto the narrow bed and finally allowed herself to weep. Not the dramatic sobs the townspeople would have expected, but quiet tears of exhaustion and overwhelming relief. For the first time in months, she was somewhere safe. Downstairs, Silas sat at his kitchen table while Mrs. McKay prepared the evening meal. She had been his housekeeper for 3 years, ever since her husband died and left her with nowhere else to go. She ran his household with quiet efficiency and had never questioned his decisions until now. "You know what you've done, don't you?" she asked, without looking up from the stew she was stirring. "Helped a woman in need. Painted a target on your back the size of Texas." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "Augustus Riddell doesn't make idle threats. He owns half this county and has the other half too scared to breathe wrong. Someone had to stand up to him. Did they? And what happens when he comes calling? When your credit gets mysteriously called in, or your cattle start dying of strange diseases, or the sheriff finds reasons to harass your hands?" Silas set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Then I deal with it. The way you dealt with Sarah." The words hit like a physical blow. Mrs. McKay regretted them immediately, but they couldn't be taken back. Silas's face went stone cold. "That was different," he said quietly. "Was it young woman in trouble facing down a mob needing someone to stand up for her?" Mrs. McKay's voice gentled. "I know about your sister, Silas. You've told the story enough times when the whiskey made you talkative. This won't bring Sarah back. No. But it might let you sleep without seeing her face every night." Through the window, they could see dust clouds approaching 3 riders moving fast. Silas recognized them before they were close enough to make out faces Dutch Carver Riddell's foreman and 2 of his hired guns. "Speaking of the devil," Mrs. McKay muttered. Silas stood and checked his sidearm and then walked out onto the porch. The 3 riders pulled up at the edge of his yard, their horses lathered from hard travel. Dutch Carver was a big man with scarred knuckles and dead eyes. The other 2 were younger, hungrier, the type who'd kill for pleasure as much as pay. "Afternoon, Hartwell." Dutch called out, making no move to dismount. "Heard you picked up some unwanted cargo in town today." "My land, my business." "See, that's where you're wrong. Mr. Riddell made it real clear that helping that woman goes against community interests. Wouldn't want to be a bad neighbor, would you? Wouldn't want to shoot 3 men on my own property either. But a man doesn't always get to choose his troubles." Dutch smiled without warmth. "Big words for a man standing alone. Am I alone?" 2 figures emerged from the barn, Tom Bradley, Silas's foreman, and Jake Morrison, barely 20, but deadly with a rifle. Both men carried weapons, with practiced ease. The odds shifted. 3 against 1 was easy math. 3 against 3 with the 3 holding high ground was a different equation. Dutch's smile faded. "This ain't over, Hartwell. Didn't expect it would be. But it's over for today. Sun's getting low and there's dangerous animals that come out after dark." The riders wheeled their horses and departed in a cloud of dust and curses. Tom and Jake approached the porch, weapons still ready. "Trouble coming, boss?" Tom asked. He was an old cavalry sergeant with Apache scars and steady hands. "Already here. Double the watch tonight and send word to the neighboring ranches. They should know what's brewing." As sunset painted the western sky in shades of amber and blood, Silas found himself wondering if he just signed his own death warrant. But upstairs, through the thin walls, he could hear Isabeau moving around her room, settling in for what might be her first peaceful night in months. Maybe that was worth the risk. Maybe it wasn't. But it was too late now to find out. The attack came at dawn 3 days later, when the world was caught between darkness and light. Silas woke to the sound of gunshots and Tom's voice shouting warnings. He rolled out of bed, grabbed his rifle, and ran to the window. The ranch yard was chaos. Mounted men circled the buildings, firing into the air and whooping like wild Indians. But this wasn't random violence. It was calculated intimidation. They weren't trying to kill anyone, yet just deliver a message. Silas yanked on his boots and headed downstairs, nearly colliding with Mrs. McKay in the hallway. She was dressed in her nightgown, but held a double-barreled shotgun with obvious familiarity. "Where's Miss Moreau?" "You locked in her room like I told her." "What's the plan?" "End this before it gets worse." He stepped onto the front porch, rifle ready, but not quite aimed. The riders converged their leader, removing his hat to reveal Dutch Carver's scarred face. "Morning, Hartwell. Hope we didn't wake you. Just thought you should know your well's been having problems." The acrid smell hit him, then poison in the water. They dumped lye or worse into his well enough to kill livestock and make the water undrinkable for weeks. "That's unfortunate," Silas replied conversationally. "Of course, poisoning a man's water is a hanging offense in civilized territory. Is it funny thing Sheriff Morrison seems to think harboring fugitives is worse? In fact, he's waiting in town with arrest warrants." "On what charges?" "Vagrancy, disturbing the peace, public immorality." "Does it matter?" Dutch's grin widened. "Point is, she's coming with us. You can hand her over peaceful-like, or we can discuss it after we burn down everything you've built. Your choice." From his peripheral vision, Silas could see his men taking positions. Tom had his rifle trained on Dutch from the barn loft. Jake was behind the water trough with a clear shot at 2 riders. But there were 8 men in Dutch's party, spread out to minimize casualties from defensive fire. Before Silas could respond, the front door opened behind him. Isabeau emerged, dressed in her traveling clothes and carrying a small bundle. "I'll go with them," she said quietly. "I won't have your ranch destroyed because of me." "Like hell." Silas snapped, then caught himself. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but running won't solve this. Riddell wants you gone permanent-like." "Then what do you suggest? Fight an army with 3 men and a woman?" "I'm not exactly helpless," Mrs. McKay muttered, hefting her shotgun. Despite everything, Isabeau almost smiled. "I don't understand why you're risking everything for a stranger. Sometimes standing up to bullies is its own reward." Silas said, "Sometimes good people die for nothing, and sometimes they die for something worthwhile. I'd rather find out which this is than spend the rest of my life wondering." Dutch was losing patience. "Time's up. We'll take the woman now, Hartwell. Easy or hard, your choice." That's when Silas made a decision that would change everything. "I'll make you a deal," he called out. "Information for time." Dutch paused. "I'm listening." "The woman knows more than you think. More than Riddell knows. But it's not something I can explain with your boys listening. Some secrets are worth more than others." It was a desperate gambit, but Dutch's eyes sharpened with interest. After a moment, he nodded to his men. "Boys, tie them up. All of them. We're taking a little trip back to town." As rough hands bound his wrists, Silas caught Isabeau's eye and tried to convey reassurance he didn't feel. He'd just bought them time, but at the cost of making their situation infinitely more dangerous. The ride back to Badwater Crossing was a nightmare of dust, heat, and humiliation. They were tied to horses and forced to maintain pace, while Dutch's men whooped and hollered around them. By the time they reached town, word had spread, and half the population had turned out to watch. Augustus Riddell waited on the same platform where Isabeau had been humiliated before. He wore his finest black suit, complete with gold watch chain and diamond stick pin. His pale eyes glittered with satisfaction as his prisoners were brought before him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the assembled crowd, "today we witness the wages of defying natural order. Mr. Hartwell chose to harbor a criminal. Miss Moreau chose to remain where she was unwelcome. Both will now face consequences." The crowd murmured approval, though Silas noticed several troubled faces. Doc Harrison stood near the front, his medical bag clutched tightly. The blonde girl, Ellie Palmer, was there too, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Now then," Riddell continued, We have learned disturbing information about our unwelcome guest. It seems Miss Moreau possesses knowledge of certain irregularities in territorial land management. Knowledge that could prove embarrassing to honest businessmen. Silas's blood ran cold. Somehow Riddell had learned about the documents. Therefore, Riddell announced, "It has become necessary to ensure this knowledge dies with her." Some might call it murder. I prefer to think of it as protecting our community's economic future. The crowd's murmur turned ugly. Several men pushed forward, faces flushed with excitement. But others hung back, expressions troubled. Doc Harrison stepped forward. "This has gone too far, Augustus. Whatever this woman knows, she doesn't deserve to die for it. Doesn't she, Doctor? She carries the bastard child of a man who would have destroyed our way of life. That child could make claims on property and water rights that would bankrupt half the county. You're talking about murdering a pregnant woman. I'm talking about protecting our future. Sometimes that requires difficult choices." It was Ellie Palmer who broke the deadlock. The banker's daughter stepped onto the platform, her blonde hair shining in the afternoon sun. "Mr. Riddell," she said clearly, "you speak of protecting our community. But what kind of community murders innocent women?" "Miss Palmer, perhaps you should let your elders handle this." "My elders seem to have forgotten what it means to be civilized human beings." The words struck like a slap. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Doubt crept into previously certain faces. But it wasn't enough. Riddell gestured to Dutch, who produced a coiled rope. They were going to hang Isabeau right there in front of everyone as an object lesson. As the noose was prepared, Silas struggled against his bond's mind racing. There had to be something, some way to turn this around. That's when they heard approaching horses, many horses coming fast from the territorial road. The crowd turned to see what new development was approaching. What they saw was Sheriff Morrison riding hard, followed by a woman in traveling clothes and a dozen men in territorial marshal uniforms. But something was wrong with the picture. The marshals had their weapons drawn, and they were pointing them at Sheriff Morrison's back. The lead marshal was a woman in her 40s, auburn-haired with green eyes that missed nothing. When she spoke, her voice carried absolute authority. "I am Marshal Catherine Thorne, Territorial Law Enforcement. By authority vested in me by the governor, I order this assembly to disperse immediately." Augustus Riddell stepped forward, his politician's instincts taking over. "Marshal, I'm Augustus Riddell, civic leader and businessman. We're conducting a legal proceeding here." "Legal proceeding?" Marshal Thorne's gaze swept over the scene. "This looks like a lynching. Sheriff Morrison has valid warrants. Sheriff Morrison is under arrest for conspiracy and fraud." She gestured to her men, who immediately moved to surround Morrison. "The warrants he's carrying are forgeries." The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd. Morrison's face went ashen as he realized his corruption had been exposed. Marshal Thorne approached Isabeau, producing a knife to cut her bonds. "Miss Moreau, I presume I've been looking for you. You know who I am. I know exactly who you are. You're the woman who was going to marry my brother William." The words hit like a thunderbolt. William's sister, a federal marshal with the authority to make arrests and protect witnesses. "Is he—" Isabeau couldn't finish the question. "Dead. Murdered 4 months ago in Denver. But not before he told me about you and the evidence he'd hidden." As Marshal Thorne freed the others, she continued, "We've been building a case against the railroad conspiracy. Your testimony combined with William's evidence will put powerful people in prison. But I don't have the documents." Isabeau protested. "Actually, you do. William was cleverer than anyone realized." Marshal Thorne smiled grimly. "The key you carry doesn't lead to a safety deposit box in Denver. It opens a hidden compartment in the church bell tower right here in Badwater Crossing." Before anyone could respond, Augustus Riddell made his move. "You're making a terrible mistake, Marshal. I have connections you can't imagine." "He had connections," Marshal Thorne corrected. "Most of them are already in federal custody. You're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and about a dozen federal crimes. But Riddell wasn't finished. As Marshal Thorne's men moved to arrest him, he pulled a derringer from his coat and pressed it to Ellie Palmer's head. The girl had been standing too close, and now she was his human shield. "As nobody moves," Riddell snarled. "I've spent 30 years building my empire, and I won't see it destroyed by some idealistic fool and his whore." The standoff was tense, dangerous. Riddell had nothing left to lose, which made him infinitely more dangerous. His pale eyes had the wild look of a cornered animal. "Let the girl go," Marshal Thorne said calmly. "She's got nothing to do with this." "She's got everything to do with it. Her father's bank holds half the loans in this county. Her cooperation will be essential for rebuilding after this unfortunate incident." "There won't be any rebuilding. Your empire is finished." "Perhaps. But I can still choose who dies with it." That's when Silas acted. While everyone's attention was focused on Riddell and his hostage, he had been working his bonds loose. The ropes had been tied hastily, more for show than security. Now, in one fluid motion, he broke free and launched himself at Riddell. The two men crashed to the platform in a tangle of limbs. The derringer went off the bullet, whining harmlessly into the air. Ellie scrambled away, sobbing with relief. Silas and Riddell fought desperately, rolling across the wooden planks. Despite his age, Riddell was strong and fought with the fury of desperation. But Silas was younger, harder, and fueled by months of suppressed rage. The fight ended when Silas managed to wrap his hands around Riddell's throat. For a moment, the desire for revenge was overwhelming. This man had threatened Isabeau, had tried to murder an unborn child, had corrupted an entire town with fear and greed. "Silas, no." Isabeau's voice cut through his rage. "Don't become like him." Slowly, reluctantly, Silas released his grip. Riddell collapsed, gasping and beaten, but alive. Marshal Thorne's men moved in to secure him. "It's over," Marshal Thorne announced to the crowd. Augustus Riddell and his associates are under federal arrest. The conspiracy he represented has been exposed and dismantled. But even as the immediate crisis ended, Silas sensed that the real consequences were just beginning. They had won this battle, but the war for justice would continue long after the prisoners were taken away. Over the next several hours, the truth began to emerge. The documents hidden in the church bell tower contained evidence of a conspiracy that reached from small-town corruption all the way to Washington, D.C. Railroad companies, territorial officials, federal judges, all connected in a web of bribery and land fraud that had stolen millions of acres from legitimate settlers. William Thorne had died trying to expose it all, but his evidence would live on to bring down the criminals who had killed him. As evening approached, Isabeau found herself sitting in Doc Harrison's office, being examined to ensure the day's trauma hadn't harmed her unborn child. The baby was fine, kicking vigorously, as if eager to enter a world that suddenly seemed full of possibility again. "You're lucky," Doc Harrison said as he finished his examination. "Both of you. This could have ended very differently." "It almost did," Isabeau replied. "If Silas hadn't. He's a good man. Took courage to stand up the way he did." Outside, they could hear the sounds of celebration as word spread that Augustus Riddell's reign was over. But Isabeau felt strangely detached from the festivities. The immediate danger had passed, but questions remained. What would happen now? Where would she go? How would she raise William's child alone? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Ellie Palmer stood in the doorway, her face tear-streaked but determined. "Miss Moreau, I wanted to apologize. For what I said in the square that first day, for not standing up sooner, for being a coward." "You weren't a coward when it mattered," Isabeau replied gently. "You stood up to Riddell when everyone else was too afraid. Only after you and Mr. Hartwell showed me what courage looked like." Ellie stepped into the room, clutching something in her hands. "I brought you this." She held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a beautiful baby blanket, hand-knitted in soft blue and white yarn. "I made it myself," Ellie said shyly. "I know it's not much, but I wanted your baby to have something special. Something made with love instead of fear." Isabeau accepted the gift with tears in her eyes. "It's perfect. Thank you. Will you stay in Badwater Crossing? Now that it's safe, I mean." It was a question Isabeau had been avoiding. Badwater Crossing held nothing but painful memories for her. But it was also where she had found unexpected allies, where strangers had risked everything to protect her. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I need time to think." That evening, as the celebrations continued in town, Isabeau sat on the porch of Silas's ranch house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The events of the past few days felt surreal, like something from a dime novel rather than real life. Silas joined her on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the desert coming alive as darkness approached. "The Marshal Thorne says the federal government will compensate you for your testimony," Silas said eventually. "Enough to start fresh wherever you want to go." "And where would that be? I have no family, no home to return to. William was everything I had, and he's gone. You have options now, more than you did a week ago." Do I, or am I just trading one kind of uncertainty for another?" Silas considered this. "I suppose that depends on what you're looking for. If you want security, you could go back east, find some city where nobody knows your story. If you want adventure, there's California or Oregon Territory. And if you want—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "If you want a home, well, there's always here. Here. The ranch needs rebuilding after what Riddell's men did to it. Could use an extra pair of hands. Mrs. McKay's not getting any younger, and she could use help with the household duties. And when the baby comes—" He shrugged. "Children need room to grow, and there's plenty of that here." Isabeau studied his profile in the fading light. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a place to belong, if you want it." The offer was tempting, more tempting than she wanted to admit. But it also raised questions she wasn't ready to answer. What about the people in town? "They might accept me now that Riddell's gone, but memories run long in places like this. Some will remember. Others will choose to forget. And the ones who matter will judge you by what you do from now on, not what happened before." As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. McKay appeared on the porch, carrying a 3rd cup of coffee and her own chair. "Don't mind me," she said, settling herself comfortably. "Just thought I'd enjoy the evening air." For a few minutes, the 3 of them sat in companionable silence. Then Mrs. McKay spoke again. "You know, I was thinking about that spare room. It's plenty big enough for a nursery if a person wanted to fix it up proper. Good light from the east window, nice and warm in the mornings." "Mrs. McKay," Isabeau protested, "I couldn't impose." "Impose nothing. This place has been too quiet for too long. Could use some young voices around here." She took a sip of her coffee. "Besides, I delivered enough babies in my younger days to know what I'm doing. Could be useful to have someone experienced around when your time comes." "That's very kind, but nothing. You're family now, whether you stay or go. Any woman brave enough to face down Augustus Riddell is family in my book." The simple declaration hit Isabeau harder than all the day's dramatic events combined. Family. The word seemed foreign, almost too precious to believe in. "I don't know anything about ranching," she said weakly. "You'll learn," Silas replied. "And your child will grow up knowing the value of honest work and wide-open spaces." As they prepared to go inside for the night, Marshal Thorne arrived with news from town. The federal investigation was expanding, with arrests being made as far away as Washington, D.C. Augustus Riddell would spend the rest of his life in prison, along with most of his co-conspirators. "There's something else," Marshal Thorne said, producing a small wooden box. William's personal effects. The marshals in Denver finally released them. With trembling hands, Isabeau opened the box. Inside was William's watch, his badge, and a letter addressed to her in his careful handwriting. She read it silently, tears streaming down her face. "He proposed," she said finally. In the letter, he said he was going to ask me to marry him as soon as his investigation was complete. He wanted our child to have his name and protection. "Then that's what the baby will have," Marshal Thorne said firmly. "William Thorne Jr. if it's a boy, or maybe Catherine Thorne if it's a girl." As the weeks passed, Isabeau gradually settled into life at the ranch. She helped Mrs. McKay with household tasks, learned about caring for livestock, and slowly began to believe that she might actually have found a home. The townspeople's attitudes toward her shifted as well. Without Augustus Riddell's influence poisoning their minds, many began to see her as she truly was, a young woman who had suffered greatly, but refused to be broken by it. Ellie Palmer became a regular visitor, bringing news from town and gradually becoming like a younger sister. Even Sheriff Morrison's replacement, a fair-minded man named Tom Crawford, went out of his way to ensure Isabeau felt welcome and protected. But it was the growing relationship with Silas that surprised her most. What had begun as simple gratitude evolved into something deeper, respect, affection, and eventually something that might have been love. He never pressed for more than she was ready to give, never made demands or assumptions about their future together. 3 months after the confrontation in town, on a crisp autumn morning, Isabeau went into labor. Mrs. McKay had been preparing for weeks, gathering medical supplies and enlisting Doc Harrison's assistance. The labor was long and difficult, but not dangerous. And when the afternoon sun reached its peak, the sound of a baby's cry filled the ranch house. "It's a girl," Mrs. McKay announced, her weathered face bright with joy. "Beautiful and healthy." Silas waited on the porch, pacing with nervous energy, despite having no biological claim to the child. When Mrs. McKay finally emerged with the news, he felt relief and happiness that surprised him with their intensity. When he was allowed into the bedroom, he found Isabeau exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in Ellie's handmade blanket. "Then meet Catherine Sarah Thorne," Isabeau said softly. "Catherine for her Aunt Sarah for your sister, the one you couldn't save." Silas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did. Your sister deserves to be remembered. And this little girl deserves to carry the name of someone who would have stood up for her." Baby Catherine opened her dark eyes and seemed to look directly at Silas. In that moment, biology became irrelevant. This child was his daughter in every way that mattered. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She is. And she's going to grow up knowing there are good people in the world, people who do the right thing even when it's hard." As winter settled over the ranch, their unconventional family grew stronger. Marshal Thorne visited regularly, doting on her niece. Ellie Palmer spent more time at the ranch than in town helping with baby Catherine, and gradually falling in love with ranch life herself. One evening, as Silas sat on the porch watching the sunset, Isabeau joined him with Catherine, sleeping peacefully in her arms. The baby was 3 months old now, growing stronger every day. "She's getting so big," Isabeau said, settling into the chair beside him. "She is. Won't be long before she's walking and getting into mischief." "Good. The world needs more troublemakers, the kind who cause trouble for the right reasons." They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Finally, Isabeau spoke again. "I've been thinking about William lately, about what he would have wanted for Catherine, for all of us. What do you think he would have wanted? For us to be happy? For his daughter to grow up in a world where justice means something? For the sacrifices to matter?" Silas studied her profile in the starlight. Over the months, he had watched her transform from a frightened, desperate woman into someone strong and confident. The harsh lines of grief had softened, replaced by something that looked very much like contentment. "Do you think they did matter, I mean?" Isabeau looked down at her sleeping daughter and then across at the lights of Badwater Crossing twinkling in the distance. The town was different now. Freer, more honest, no longer cowering under Augustus Riddell's iron grip. "Yes," she said simply. "I think they did." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Marshal Thorne was riding up the path, but she wasn't alone. A second rider accompanied her, a young man in a cavalry uniform. "Evening," Marshal Thorne called out as they dismounted. "Hope we're not disturbing you." "Not at all," Silas replied, though he noticed the tension in the marshal's voice. "What brings you out this way? News from back east? Some of it good, some complicated." She gestured to her companion. "This is Lieutenant James Morrison, no relation to our former sheriff. He's carrying dispatches from Washington." The young officer stepped forward, removing his hat respectfully. "Mr. Hartwell, Miss Moreau, I have information regarding the railroad conspiracy trials and their aftermath." They gathered in the main room while Mrs. McKay prepared coffee. Lieutenant Morrison opened his dispatch case and withdrew several official-looking documents. "The good news first," he began. "Harold Ashford and his associates have been convicted on all counts. The conspiracy has been completely exposed, and reforms are being implemented to prevent similar corruption in the future." "And the complicated news?" Isabeau asked, though she dreaded the answer. "There are still powerful people who lost fortunes when the conspiracy was exposed. While most have accepted their losses, a few haven't. We have intelligence suggesting that at least 2 separate groups are planning retaliation against key witnesses." The words hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Isabeau felt her blood turn to ice water. "What kind of retaliation?" Silas asked. "The permanent kind," Marshal Thorne said grimly. "They can't undo the convictions or recover their stolen lands, but they can prevent future testimony and send a message to other potential witnesses." "How credible is this intelligence?" "Credible enough that the Attorney General authorized me to offer you federal protection. Both of you and the baby. New identities, relocation to a secure territory, ongoing security." Isabeau's arms tightened around Catherine. Just when she had finally found peace, the specter of violence was rising again. "For how long?" she asked. "Indefinitely. These aren't the kind of men who forget or forgive." "What's the alternative?" Lieutenant Morrison consulted his papers. "Stay and take your chances. We'll provide what protection we can, but our resources are limited. And frankly, if they're determined enough," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the implications. "How long do we have to decide?" Silas asked. "They want an answer by morning. If you choose relocation, transport will arrive tomorrow evening." After the marshal and lieutenant departed, the ranch fell into troubled silence. Mrs. McKay busied herself with cleaning, but her movements were sharp and agitated. Silas paced the main room like a caged wolf. Isabeau sat rocking Catherine, her mind racing through impossible choices. "What are you thinking?" Silas asked finally. "That I'm tired of running. Tired of being afraid. Tired of letting evil men dictate how I live my life." "This isn't about pride, Isabeau. It's about survival." "Is it because from where I sit, it looks like letting them win? Again." Mrs. McKay set down her dish rag with more force than necessary. "Pride don't stop bullets, child. Neither does running if they're determined enough." Isabeau looked up at both of them. William died because he believed some things were worth the risk. He could have stayed quiet, kept his head down, lived a safe, meaningless life. Instead, he chose to fight. "And look how that turned out," Mrs. McKay said bluntly. "It turned out with Augustus Riddell in prison and his conspiracy destroyed. It turned out with corrupt officials facing justice. It turned out with this baby having a chance to grow up in a better world. Isabeau's voice grew stronger with each word. William's death mattered because he chose to make it matter. So what are you saying? Silas asked. I'm saying I won't run again. I won't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder wondering when they'll find us. And I won't raise Catherine to believe that cowards inherit the earth. This isn't cowardice, it's prudence. Sometimes there's no difference. They argued late into the night, but Isabeau's mind was made up. She would stay, would face whatever came, would make her stand on ground of her own choosing. If she was going to die, it would be as herself, not hiding behind a false name in some distant territory. The next morning brought unexpected allies. Doc Harrison arrived first, carrying his medical bag and a grim expression. When heard about the federal offer, he said without preamble. Also heard you might be fool enough to turn it down. It's not foolishness. Like hell it isn't. But I understand it. He set his bag on the kitchen table. So if you're staying, we'd better make sure you're ready for whatever comes. Ellie Palmer arrived next, followed by her father and several other prominent townspeople. Word had spread about the threat and opinions were divided. You should take the government's offer, Banker Palmer said. No sense in everyone getting killed over principle. Principle is all we've got left, Doc Harrison countered. We let them murder witnesses with impunity, and the whole system collapses. The system's already collapsed if we can't protect innocent women and children. The debate raged for hours, but gradually a consensus emerged. The majority wanted Isabeau to stay, not just for her sake, but for theirs. If they surrendered to intimidation now, they would never be free of it. All right then, Marshal Thorne said when the discussion finally ended. If you're staying, we do this right. Full security measures, coordinated defense, early warning systems. You're going to help? Isabeau asked, surprised. I'm going to try to keep you alive long enough to testify at the next round of trials. After that, you're on your own. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. The ranch was fortified with additional men and weapons. Early warning stations were established on the surrounding ridges. Escape routes were planned and rehearsed. But despite all the precautions, when the attack finally came, it was nothing like they had expected. It started with a single rider approaching under a white flag of truce. He was well-dressed, middle-aged, with the soft look of a man who had never done hard physical labor. He identified himself as Jonathan Blackwood, representing certain business interests that had been damaged by the conspiracy revelations. I'm here to negotiate, he announced to the assembled defenders. My principals are reasonable men who prefer commerce to violence. What kind of negotiation? Marshal Thorne called back. Simple. Miss Moreau provides a statement recanting her previous testimony, claiming she was coerced or mistaken. In exchange, she and her child receive a substantial financial settlement and guaranteed safe passage out of the territory. And if she refuses, Blackwood's expression didn't change, but his voice took on a harder edge. Then my principals will be forced to pursue less civilized alternatives. How many men do you have? Silas asked. Enough. But that's not really the question you should be asking. What should I be asking? You should be asking how many innocent people in Badwater Crossing will suffer if this escalates beyond negotiation. The threat was clear. If they fought here, the violence would spread to the town. Women and children who had nothing to do with the conspiracy would pay the price for Isabeau's refusal to cooperate. I need time to consider, Isabeau called out. Of course, you have until sunset. After that, the offer expires. As Blackwood rode away, a fierce debate erupted among the defenders. Some argued for accepting the deal, others for fighting regardless of consequences. But the deciding factor was Ellie Palmer's quiet observation. He's lying about something, she said. The way he held himself, the words he chose. My father taught me to read people in business negotiations, and that man was definitely lying. About what? I don't know. But something about his story doesn't add up. Her instincts proved correct when Tom Bradley returned from a scouting mission with disturbing news. "There are men surrounding the town," he reported. "At least 30 of them, all armed, all in position to cut off escape routes. This isn't about negotiation, it's about containment. They're planning to attack regardless," Marshal Thorne concluded. "The negotiation was just to keep us talking while they got into position." "Then we fight," Silas said simply. "Against 30 men with a baby in the house. We've faced worse odds. When Augustus Riddell had the whole town against us. We won then, we can win now." But even as he spoke, the brave words, Silas knew this would be different. Riddell had been constrained by his need to maintain a facade of respectability. These men had no such limitations. The attack began at dusk, not with a direct assault, but with fire arrows aimed at the barn and outbuildings. The strategy was clear force the defenders out of cover, then pick them off in the open. "They're trying to burn us out," Tom Bradley observed as he and Jake worked to beat down flames in the hayloft. "Let them try," Mrs. McKay said grimly. She had positioned herself at an upstairs window with her shotgun covering the approaches to the main house. The battle that followed was unlike anything in Silas's experience. These weren't local thugs or corrupt officials, they were professional killers, disciplined and patient. They used covering fire and coordinated movements, advancing systematically, while minimizing their own casualties. But the defenders had advantages too. They knew the terrain, had prepared their positions carefully, and were fighting for their lives rather than money. Most importantly, they were fighting for something they believed in. The turning point came when Ellie Palmer spotted movement in the darkness that the others had missed. "There," she called out, pointing toward the eastern ridge. "Someone's signaling from the rocks." At first, Silas thought it might be more attackers. Then he realized the truth: Blackwood's men were being observed by someone else, someone not part of the assault force. "Num," he called to his foreman. "That ridge, can you see who's up there?" Tom raised his rifle scope to his eye, then grinned. "Well, I'll be damned. It's half the men from Badwater Crossing armed and looking for a fight." The townspeople had come after all despite the danger. They had slipped out after dark and taken positions on the surrounding ridges, ready to catch Blackwood's men in a crossfire. But Blackwood was no fool. When he realized his force was surrounded, he adapted quickly. "That new plan," his voice carried across the ranch yard. "If we can't take her alive, we make sure she can't testify." The meaning was clear. They were switching from capture to assassination. Several riflemen began concentrating their fire on the main house, trying to punch through the walls and kill Isabeau and her baby. That's when Silas made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I'm going out there," he told Marshal Thorne. "That's suicide. Maybe. But it'll draw their fire away from the house." Before anyone could stop him, he was running across the open ground toward the barn, deliberately making himself a target. Bullets whined around him, but he made it to cover and began returning fire. His gambit worked temporarily. The attackers shifted their attention to him, giving the others breathing room. But it also exposed him to concentrated fire from multiple directions. He was hit twice before he realized it, once in the shoulders, once in the thigh. The wounds weren't immediately fatal, but they slowed him down and limited his mobility. "Silas," Isabeau's voice cut through the gunfire. She was standing in the doorway of the main house, Catherine in her arms, her face white with terror. "Stay inside," he called back, but she was already moving, running toward him with no regard for her own safety. "You fool," she gasped as she reached his position. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about keeping you and Catherine alive." "By getting yourself killed." Before he could answer, the sound of thundering hooves filled the air. The townspeople on the ridges had mounted a cavalry charge, sweeping down from 3 directions at once. Caught between the ranch defenders and this new assault, Blackwood's men began to break and run. But Blackwood himself wasn't finished. As his hired guns fled or fell, he emerged from cover with a rifle, heading straight for the main house. His intention was clear. If he couldn't complete his mission through subordinates, he would do it personally. "The baby," Mrs. McKay screamed from the upstairs window. "He's going for the baby." Blackwood was closer to the house than anyone else. Even wounded Silas pushed himself to his feet and began stumbling toward the building, but he knew he wouldn't make it in time. That's when Ellie Palmer appeared in Blackwood's path, armed with nothing but determination and her father's hunting rifle. She was barely 19, had never fired a shot in anger, but she stood between the killer and the innocent child without hesitation. "Stop right there," she called out, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. Blackwood raised his rifle. "Move aside, girl. This doesn't concern you. Everything that happens in this town concerns me." "Then you can die with the rest of them." The two shots came almost simultaneously. Blackwood's bullet took Ellie in the chest, spinning her around and dropping her to the ground. But her shot, fired even as she was falling, caught him center mass and put him down for good. The battle was over, but the cost was becoming clear. Tom Bradley was dead, killed by a sniper's bullet while defending the barn. Jake Morrison was wounded but would recover. Several of the townspeople had been hit during their charge, though none fatally, and Ellie Palmer lay dying in the ranch yard, her blood staining the dust dark. Doc Harrison reached her first, but they all knew it was too late. The bullet had done too much damage for the primitive medical techniques available in 1870. "Did we win?" she whispered as Isabeau knelt beside her, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," Isabeau replied. "We won." "Good. I'm glad. I'm glad I finally did something that mattered." She died with the sunrise, surrounded by people who had come to love her courage and idealism. Her sacrifice had saved not just Isabeau and Catherine, but the principle that justice was worth defending even at the ultimate cost. The aftermath was a mix of triumph and grief. The surviving attackers were arrested and would face federal charges. The conspiracy was truly finished, now its last desperate attempt at revenge having failed completely. But the price had been high, good people had died, and the survivors would carry the scars forever. Marshal Thorne stayed for the funerals, then prepared to return to her duties in the territorial capital. Before leaving, she had a final conversation with Isabeau. "The offer of federal protection is still open," she said. "After what happened here, no one would blame you for taking it." "No," Isabeau replied firmly. "This is where we belong. This is where William's daughter should grow up, in a place where people stand up to evil, where justice matters more than safety." Even after losing Ellie, after seeing what it costs, especially after losing Ellie, she died believing that some things are worth dying for. I won't dishonor that by running away. As the months passed, life slowly returned to normal at the ranch. Silas recovered from his wounds, though he would always walk with a slight limp. New hands were hired to replace those who had been lost. The townspeople erected a monument to Ellie Palmer in the center of Badwater Crossing, honoring her sacrifice and the courage she had shown. Isabeau and Silas grew closer during the long process of healing and rebuilding. What had begun as gratitude evolved into respect, then affection, and finally something that looked very much like love. They married in a simple ceremony at the church, where William's evidence had been hidden, with Father Martinez officiating and half the territory in attendance. Catherine grew from a baby into a toddler, then a young child. She was fearless and curious with her mother's beauty and her adoptive father's quiet strength. She would grow up knowing that her first father had died a hero and that her second father had risked everything to protect her. The railroad conspiracy trials continued for years, with Isabeau testifying in case after case. Her courage in facing down intimidation and violence inspired other witnesses to come forward, ensuring that justice was finally served. The reforms that resulted changed how business was conducted throughout the American West, preventing similar corruption for generations to come. 5 years after the battle at the ranch, Silas stood on his porch watching Catherine play in the yard with her younger brother, William Hartwell, named for the hero who had died before his birth. Isabeau was inside nursing their newest addition, a daughter they had named Eleanor after Ellie Palmer. "You're thinking about them again," Isabeau said, joining him on the porch with baby Eleanor in her arms. "Tom and Jake, Ellie, all the people who died so we could have this. Do you regret it? The choices we made, the prices we paid?" Silas considered the question carefully. The past 5 years had brought joy and sorrow in equal measure. They had built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy, but the cost had been enormous. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret it. Evil has to be opposed, whatever the cost. If we don't stand up to it, who will? Even knowing what we know now, even knowing people would die. Especially knowing that. The people who died, they chose to make that sacrifice. They chose to stand up when it mattered. That has to mean something." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A familiar figure was riding up the path, Marshal Thorne, though she was dressed in civilian clothes and had traded her marshal's badge for a wedding ring. Young Catherine squealed, abandoning her toys to run toward her namesake. The little girl had never quite understood why she shared a name with her aunt, but she loved the attention it brought. "I have news," Marshal Thorne announced as she dismounted. The last of the conspiracy cases was resolved yesterday. Jonathan Blackwood's associates have been convicted and sentenced. It's finally over. "All of it?" Isabeau asked. "All of it. The corruption, the retaliation, the trials, everything. William's work is complete." They sat on the porch as the sun set behind the western mountains, watching the children play and talking about the future. Marshal Thorne had married a fellow law officer and was expecting her first child. The territory was becoming more civilized every year, with new schools, churches, and businesses replacing the lawless frontier of the past. "What will you do now?" Marshal Thorne asked. "Now that it's really over." Silas looked at his family, his wife, his children, the home they had built together from love and determination and shared sacrifice. "Live," he said simply. "Raise our children, work the land, try to be the kind of people Ellie and Tom and William would have been proud to know." "That's not very exciting. I've had enough excitement to last several lifetimes. Now I want something different. Peace, contentment, the knowledge that we've earned our happiness through courage and sacrifice." As Marshal Thorne prepared to leave, Isabeau walked her to her horse. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For believing in William, for protecting us, for seeing this through to the end. Thank you for having the courage to stand up when it mattered. Without you, none of this would have been possible. Without all of us. It took everyone, you, Silas, Ellie, the townspeople, even Mrs. McKay with her shotgun. None of us could have done it alone. That's the lesson, isn't it? That good people have to stand together if they want to defeat evil. That courage is contagious, but so is cowardice." As Marshal Thorne rode away into the gathering darkness, Isabeau returned to the porch where Silas was putting Catherine to bed. The little girl was sleepy, but fighting it, full of questions about why Aunt Catherine had to leave and when she would come back. "She'll visit again soon," Silas promised. "But now it's time for sleep." "Will you tell me the story?" Catherine asked, as she did every night. "Which story?" "The story about Mama and Papa William and how they fought the bad men so I could be born safe. It was a ritual they had developed, a way of keeping William's memory alive and helping Catherine understand her unique heritage." The story grew longer and more detailed as she got older, but the essential elements remained the same: good people standing up to evil, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and the belief that some things were worth any sacrifice. "Once upon a time," Silas began, "there was a brave man named William Thorne who discovered that powerful men were stealing land from honest settlers." As he told the familiar story, Isabeau stood in the doorway, holding baby Eleanor, watching her husband and daughter together. This was what William had died for, not just justice in the abstract, but the concrete reality of a child growing up safe and loved, knowing that heroes were real and that good could triumph over evil. The story ended, as it always did, with Catherine falling asleep and Silas carrying her to her room. By the time he returned to the main room, Isabeau had put Eleanor in her crib and was sitting by the fireplace, staring into the flames. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, settling beside her. "The future. What kind of world our children will inherit. A better one than we inherited. That's what we fought for, to leave things better than we found them." "Do you think we succeeded?" Silas considered the question. Augustus Riddell was dead, his conspiracy exposed and dismantled. Corrupt officials had been removed from power. Laws had been changed to prevent similar abuse. The territory was more just, more honest, more hopeful than it had been 5 years ago. "I think we made a good start," he said finally. "The rest is up to the next generation." Catherine's generation. Catherine's generation, and Eleanor's and William's. They'll face their own challenges, their own choices between courage and cowardice. All we can do is teach them what we've learned, that good people have to stand together, that justice is worth fighting for, and that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to. As they prepared for bed, Isabeau paused at Catherine's door to look in on her sleeping daughter. The little girl was curled up with the blanket Ellie Palmer had made for her, peaceful and secure in the knowledge that she was loved and protected. "She's going to ask harder questions as she gets older," Isabeau said quietly. "About why people had to die, about whether it was worth it, about what she should do when she faces similar choices." "And what will you tell her?" "The truth. That freedom isn't free, that justice requires sacrifice, and that every generation has to choose whether to stand up to evil or let it flourish." She smoothed Catherine's dark hair gently. "And that both her fathers believed some things were worth dying for." They went to bed that night, as they had every night for the past 5 years, grateful for what they had, mindful of what it had cost, and determined to prove worthy of the sacrifices that had been made on their behalf. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. In the distance, the lights of Badwater Crossing twinkled like earthbound stars, a community transformed by the courage of ordinary people who had chosen to do extraordinary things. The cowboy who had saved a pregnant woman from a lynch mob had discovered something precious in the process, that love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances, that family was more than blood, and that heroes weren't born, but made through the choices they made when it mattered most. The dust had settled. The battles had been fought and won. And in the high desert of New Mexico territory, under a canopy of stars that had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature, a family slept peacefully secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would be better than today, because good people had chosen to make it so. The story was complete, the circle closed, and justice had finally triumphed over greed and corruption. Not without cost, never without cost, but with the certainty that the sacrifice had meaning and the victory would endure. In the end, that was enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative, surrendering to evil out of fear or despair, was no alternative at all. The stars wheeled overhead, the desert slept, and in a modest ranch house in the middle of nowhere, the future was being born, one peaceful night at a time.